My name is Michael Mostyn, CEO of B'nai Brith Canada. Welcome to our event. February is Black History Month in Canada. It is time to celebrate the contributions of Black Canadians to our wonderful country in all sectors of society, the contributions that they have made to make this country great. But it is also a time to recall that the fight for racial equality is not over. There is still much that needs to be done for diversity and for inclusion here in our country. And the Jewish community continues to stand side by side with the Black community in that regard. So we hope you enjoy the program today and join us in celebrating the contributions and the continuing contributions of Black Canadians to our great nation. Thank you.
To mark Black History Month, in addition to celebrating the positive contributions made to Canadian society by the Black community, we would like to honor the relationship between Black and Jewish communities that came about as a natural outgrowth of a shared background of historical injustice and exclusion. Out of the ashes and chains of discrimination and prejudice came a determination to find a pathway to overcome bigotry and intolerance, much to the benefit of our broader society. Black history affords us all a meaningful opportunity to reflect on the struggles and hardships faced by Black people and admire their ability to persevere and triumph. And it is interesting to take note of several key moments in history that reflect the power and the mutually supportive relationship between the Black and Jewish communities. In the 1950s and 60s in the United States, as the historic civil rights movement was taking place, Blacks and Jews joined together, marched together, and in some cases put their lives on the line together to achieve civil rights, especially voting rights for Blacks. At the time, African Americans were still suffering under the bitter discrimination of Jim Crow rules. These rules mandated separate schools, separate housing, even separate washrooms and drinking fountains for Blacks and whites. Often, violence was used to deny voting rights to Blacks. Black people in Canada faced discrimination as well in housing, employment, immigration, and access to public services. Many restaurants, hotels, and theaters refused to admit or serve Black Canadians. Practices of racial segregation were justified here by perpetrating ideas about racial inferiority. In Nova Scotia, the original provisions of racial segregation in education remained law until 1950, and in Ontario, the last racially segregated school closed in 1965. One of the most prominent and heroic Black Canadian civil rights activists is Viola Desmond. In 1946, she courageously challenged racial segregation at a cinema in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, by defiantly refusing to leave a whites-only area of the Roseland Theatre. Her court case was an inspiration for the pursuit of racial equality across Canada. Today, she is rightfully honored for her bravery and activism and is featured on our Canadian $10 bill. It was in the terrible climate that Jews joined the Black struggle for equal rights by peacefully protesting and helping fight battles in the courts. Many Canadian Jews joined the struggle as well, including several well-known rabbis. In 1964, during the Freedom Summer Initiative to register Southern Black people to vote, more than half of the hundreds of lawyers assisting civil rights workers in the courts were Jewish. A painful but powerful symbol of this cooperation was the murder in Mississippi of 3 civil rights workers who were all lobbying behind the scenes to help pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, who were Jewish, and James Chaney, who was Black. After a 44-day search that received national and international attention, including in Canada, their bodies were finally discovered buried near a remote country road. They had been shot to death by a white supremacist mob. It was only decades later, in 2005, that KKK leader Edgar Ray Killen was convicted for manslaughter. No one else has ever been charged. On Sunday, March 21st, 1965, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marched with Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, in one of the pivotal moments in the civil rights movement. The two friends crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge arm in arm. Heschel found it to be a spiritual experience and later said he felt his legs were praying. Susanna Heschel, a professor of Jewish studies at Dartmouth College, has written about the bonds between her father and Martin Luther King Jr., describing it as one of the most remarkable friendships in Jewish history.
They come from such totally different backgrounds. My father from a Hasidic family in Warsaw, and Martin Luther King from a Baptist background in the American South. It's a very odd combination, and it's one of the American miracles. They had similar theological sensibilities. My father discovered a Christian who was making the Hebrew Bible the center of the American discussion. Amazing. And he was very moved by that. And the fact that my father wrote the book on the prophets also was very important. Andrew Young told me that everybody had a copy of that book on the prophets and carried it around in their pocket.
And of course I know I did, and I've kept it on my desk ever since. Yeah, it's one of the books when I move, I know where that book is.
I have always seen him as a kind of intellectual father. And whenever I get a little down or depressed, I go get one of his books and I read the prophet Isaiah and what he has to say about Isaiah.
Many times, the black community has come out to support the Jewish community. Dr. King, through his friendship with Rabbi Heschel, spoke out strongly on behalf of Jews in the former communist and highly anti-Semitic Soviet Union. He supported their struggle to be free from oppression, free to practice their faith, free to express their culture openly, and free to leave the country if they wished to. Many Jewish activists languished in prison for years merely because they wished to be free as Jews. On December 11th, 1966, Dr. King famously said, "We cannot sit complacently by the wayside while our Jewish brothers in the Soviet Union face the possible extinction of their culture and spiritual life. Those that sit at rest while others take pains are tender turtles and buy their quiet with disgrace." Dr. King also spoke out in support of the State of Israel.
The whole world must see that Israel must exist and has a right to exist and is one of the great outposts of democracy in the world.
Martin Luther King Jr. also had a strong connection to Canada, even though it is not generally known. On March 15, 1962, Dr. King spoke here in Canada at Holy Blossom Temple in Toronto as part of the Brotherhood Forum series. Rabbi Gunther Plaut recorded some of Dr. King's most powerful words. "Segregation must go, not because this struggle is important in our struggle with communism, but because it is morally wrong, because it substitutes an I-it relationship amongst people for an I-thou relationship. Time takes no sides. It is neutral and can be used either way, but time is always ripe for doing right. The long arc of history bends towards justice." According to Holy Blossom's archives, members of black Canadian groups attended Dr. King's 1962 talk, and, quoting from the archives, the fight to end informal segregation in Canada continued with some victories, including the closing of the last segregated school in Ontario in 1965. It is hard to believe that until the mid-1960s, there was segregation in schools in parts of Canada. For Jews, it was not until the mid-1970s that quotas in various departments of universities like medicine, dentistry, and law, both for students and faculty, were finally abolished. However, history of black discrimination in Canada is not without its own stains, and there is still much work to be done for blacks, Jews, and other minorities. It is vigilance in the face of discrimination and racism and concerted action against both that unite Jews and blacks. This commitment is evident in yet another fascinating anecdote involving Dr. King's Canadian connection with Holy Blossom. When Dr. King was arrested in 1963 in Alabama, the Social Action Committee of Holy Blossom under Milton Cadsby led a movement in Canada for civil rights. It raised money for both Dr. King and to help fight segregation in Canada. There was a large benefit event which included, among a long list of all Canadian performers, Harry Belafonte and the Canadian folk group The Travelers. This event was the first time We Shall Overcome was sung in Canada as a civil rights anthem. Following the event, Holy Blossom was vandalized and ransacked, and the proceeds from the event were stolen. Dr. King wrote to Cadsby, "I am very sorry that you had a misfortune at the Holy Blossom Temple. It is good to know that the break-in will not in any way defeat the continuance of your efforts. I cannot express in words the deep inspiration that comes to all of us. When we gain this kind of creative backing, it gives us renewed courage and vigor to carry on. You have demonstrated in words and deeds that you are real friends to the cause of justice and freedom." The poignancy throughout the history of Jews helping blacks and blacks helping Jews knows no boundary, and in fact, the mutual support between our communities has served to change the course of history. In 1942, at the height of World War II, as part of what was called the Commonwealth Air Training Scheme, B'nai Brith's Toronto Lodge was asked to sponsor a B'nai Brith Air Cadet Squadron. This involved recruiting, training, and equipping potential officer personnel of pre-enlistment age. Before accepting the invitation, the Lodge demanded the revision of certain regulations which had the effect of discriminating against blacks and those born of foreign parents. That demand was met and led to yet another example of blacks and Jews working together to fight discrimination, prejudice, and, in this case, the evil policies of Nazi Germany. The strength of the squadron was restricted to 200 top-notch young men. While non-denominational in character, 70% of the recruits to the squadron were Jewish. Of particular note is that a number of black young men also participated, and a black man rose to become the senior non-commissioned officer. Undoubtedly, many of these pilots, black and Jewish, working together, made important contributions to the Canadian war effort against the Nazis. Such a strong foundation of Jewish-black alliances has brought us to the present, and it is both fair and accurate to say that over the last number of years, progress in bridge building between our two communities has continued. Today at B'nai Brith Canada, our Special Advisory Council to the League of Human Rights, led by Chair Dr. Aubrey Zeidenberg, functions to bring together people from diverse communities in Canada to address issues of mutual concern. This unique group of 25 representatives reflects the new face of Canada and has been working together for over 18 years. Special Advisory Council representatives include Howard Shearer, the son of former Jamaican Prime Minister, whom we will hear from today. We will also hear from another member, Courtney Betty, an attorney who represented the family of Jordan Manners, a 15-year-old black youth who was the first student to be shot to death in Toronto schools. Following his death, leaders in the black community who were members of our Special Advisory Council reached out to B'nai Brith for support given our experience in fighting hate crime.
One of the great accomplishments that we had in the This is Black History Month was when Jordan Manners, a young black fellow, was shot to death in a school in Toronto. And at that time, approximately 8 to 10 of our members of the Advisory Council that are reflective of the diverse black communities that we enjoy here in Canada came to us and said, what can we do? We sat as a group and we determined that what we might want to try and do is hold a hearing, a court session of our own, of the people, at the Driftwood Community Center, and invite the media along with the Premier, the Mayor, the Chief of Police, and other members of Parliament, and put them in a position where they had to be transparent and speak the truth to the problems that were occurring within the communities amongst our youth. We received a phone call that notified us that they were appointing Roy McMurtry, former Chief Justice of Ontario, and Alvin Curling, former Speaker of the Legislature, to become the youth commissioners to the province of Ontario. They were sanctioned with doing a report on the roots of youth violence in Ontario, which eventually allowed us to get police officers into the schools, changes in the curriculum, and everything that was necessary to begin to protect our young children in our schools. All of this happened in the B'nai Brith boardrooms amongst our Special Advisory Council. Not just addressing the youths in the black communities, but this was something that was going to be helpful in all of our schools throughout Ontario, for protecting all of our children in a world where, one Canada for all Canadians. I mean, that's what it's all about.
You know, the Jordan Manners case, which was the first time that a young person had been killed in one of our public schools, was just hugely tragic. In some ways, might have been avoidable. But what we recognized was there are some very challenged communities within the city. And the group came together and said, how can we address it? And I mentioned immediately everyone came together, and we decided that what we would do is hold a public forum within the Jane and Finch community, and that we would subpoena the then Premier Dalton McGuinty, and if he didn't show up, then that's his choice. And so it put a lot of pressure on the Premier. We wanted to appoint a commission that would look at how do we get to the solutions, and the Premier eventually did appoint Warren McMurtry and Alvin Crowley to head up the Roots of Violence Commission, which stemmed from the death of Jordan Manners. So that was a significant accomplishment. We did it within a short period of time, and the commission came back with some very positive reports. Unfortunately, not a lot of them have been implemented, but certainly it was an accomplishment to get the government moving at that time and say, hey, we have a problem here, let's figure out how we fix it. Again, the idea of building bridges, building relationships, putting the police in the schools with the young people. You know, I actually developed a crime prevention program for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, so I have an idea of what it would take to build those relationships. And it's a different form of policing, but in my view, it's the best form of policing. And so we're able to eventually get a commitment to have 30 officers placed in our schools, in our most challenged schools, to try and build those relationships. I think that, and I've said it on numerous occasions, that the bonds and similarities between the Jewish community and the Black community, it's a two-way street. There are many lessons that I think the Jewish community can learn from the Black community, and I think there are many lessons that the Black community can learn from the Jewish community. And I think one of the things that I've really been pressing is the idea of, organizations such as B'nai Brith, our community, we need an organization similarly that can speak, times not with a unified voice, but with a strong enough voice to address our issues. And that's something that I'm hoping one day that, by aligning ourselves, we can learn some of those best practices as to how to run a national organization that can address a multitude of issues, whether it be seniors, whether it be a political issue, whether it be a social issue, a community issue, a health issue. It's an incredible situation to have one organization that can speak on all issues if the need arises.
Even though organizations such as B'nai Brith has rang the bell of alarm constantly, every day, right? Almost every year, it still takes place among us. And therefore, so for myself, I concluded that the role of B'nai Brith is very crucial to trying to hold the line and stem the, I call it, onslaught on individuals' rights, and obviously the racism as it stands today. Why the dialogue has to take place, and the proper stakeholding has to be done, and I think out of that will come because both want the same thing, right? And so the question is, there has to be a meeting of the mind somewhere along to come to that conclusion. Yeah.
In the aftermath of the horrific killing of George Floyd, the Special Advisory Council expressed its solidarity with all those mourning his death, and also with the fight against anti-Black racism in the United States, Canada, and around the world. A statement from the Council called for our communities to stand united in the goal of expunging all signs of bigotry, racial intolerance, and inequality from our great and vast land. Together, we will all get through this, and the brighter day we have long dreamed about might soon come.